Imagine you are sitting in a room in Belgium. It is the summer of 1928. Outside, the world is recovering from one war and building toward another. Inside, there are 5 men. And then one of them picks up a red pencil. He draws the line from memory, not from a surveyor's report, not from a legal brief, from memory. Nobody inside that line was in the room. This is the story of the Red Line Agreement.
Before we declassify the rest of this story, make sure you're locked in. Hit subscribe and join the investigation. Then drop a comment below. Which forgotten civilization should we expose next?
To understand what happened in that room in 1928, you need to understand what oil was becoming. At the start of the 20th century, petroleum was a curiosity. It fueled lamps, it lubricated machinery. The British Navy under Winston Churchill converted its entire fleet from coal to oil before 1914. That single decision meant the British Empire's military power was now dependent on a resource it did not fully control. But it had something almost as good. It had Iraq. Britain had a mandate over the territory that would become Iraq, handed to it by the League of Nations after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And Mesopotamia sat above one of the largest oil deposits on Earth. By the mid-1920s, 5 entities dominated global oil: Anglo-Persian, Royal Dutch Shell, CFP, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York. These were instruments of state power. Anglo-Persian was 51% owned by the British government. The San Remo Agreement of 1920 divided Ottoman oil between Britain and France. The US invoked the open door policy. In 1925, the League of Nations ruled Mosul province would be part of British Mandate Iraq. The Turkish Petroleum Company was reorganized into the Iraq Petroleum Company. In plain English, if you signed this agreement, you agreed not to compete. Alone, you were locked out. This is what a cartel looks like when it's written down. And this is what it covered. Let's look at exactly what was built. The Iraq Petroleum Company, the vehicle for everything, was divided like this. Anglo-Persian Oil Company got 23.75%. Royal Dutch Shell got 23.75%. The French company CFP got 23.75%. Near East Development Corporation, a holding company for Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, got 23.75%. And Calouste Gulbenkian, the man who drew the line, got 5%. That last 5% is famous. He became known as Mr. 5%. Now look at what those percentages meant in practice. No single party held a majority. No single party could move without the others. Every concession application inside the red line zone had to be brought to the IPC table. If one party wanted to develop a field independently, the self-denying clause kicked in. They had to offer it to the joint company first. The other partners could veto, delay, or simply refuse to move. This was not an accident. The goal was not to develop all the oil as fast as possible. The goal was to control the rate of development. to prevent a flood of cheap Middle Eastern crude from collapsing the global price. The same year the Red Line Agreement was signed, the same companies signed a second agreement at a Scottish castle called Achnacarry. That agreement, the As-Is Agreement, froze global market shares. You keep your percentage, I keep mine. No competing, no price wars. Two agreements, 1 month apart. One locked the territory, one locked the price. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission, when it investigated in 1952, called it what it was, an international petroleum cartel. Here's the thing about a cartel. If you build the walls carefully enough, the space outside the walls becomes extraordinarily valuable. Saudi Arabia was inside the Red Line. Technically, any IPC signatory that wanted a Saudi oil concession had to bring it to the joint table. That meant the other partners could block it. That meant nobody moved. In 1933, King Ibn Saud needed money. His kingdom was poor. He had a large territory and very little revenue. A representative of Standard Oil of California arrived with an offer: 35,000 pounds in gold, up front, for an oil exploration concession. Standard Oil of California, SoCal, had not signed the Red Line Agreement. It was not an IPC partner. The self-denying clause did not apply to it. Ibn Saud signed. Six years later, in 1938, SoCal struck oil at Dammam Well No. 7. What they found beneath the Arabian desert was not just an oil field. It was the largest conventional oil reserve ever discovered. It would eventually become Saudi Aramco, today the most profitable company in human history, with annual revenues that exceed the GDP of most countries. The Red Line signatories, Anglo-Persian, Shell, CFP, Standard Oil of New Jersey, had locked themselves out. They had built a cartel to control the oil, and the cartel's own terms had handed the greatest oil discovery in history to the one major company that wasn't in the room. This is what happens when monopoly logic overreaches. The walls you build to keep competitors out also keep you in. By 1952, the United States government knew exactly what had happened. The Federal Trade Commission spent years investigating. They obtained internal company documents. They traced the agreements. They mapped the market share arrangements. And they published a 400-page report that named the Red Line Agreement, the Achnacarry Agreement, and the web of subsidiary arrangements as components of an illegal international cartel, one in which American companies were full participants. The Justice Department opened a criminal antitrust case. And then, the State Department made a call. The Cold War was 3 years old. The Soviet Union was expanding. The argument, made at the highest levels of the Truman administration, was simple. Prosecuting the oil cartel would destabilize the companies that supplied allied nations with energy. You don't break the thing you need to win. The criminal case became a civil suit. The civil suit dragged on for years. Eventually, it was dropped. The same logic that built the Red Line, geopolitical interest overriding legal principle, now protected it from the law. Here is the counter-argument you should hear. The oil companies were not purely villains in this story. They provided real capital investment in territories with no infrastructure. They built pipelines, trained workers, created industries. The development they enabled was real. But they built things and they built things on fair terms are two different claims. The concession agreements gave host governments royalties of 4 shillings per ton in Iraq's case, a fixed fee, regardless of price, regardless of volume growth. When oil prices rose, the company's profits rose. The Iraqi government's royalty stayed flat. It was not a partnership. It was a lease with one party setting all the terms. The Red Line Agreement was formally dissolved after 1948, when the American companies broke it to join Aramco. Gulbenkian sued. He settled. He died in a Lisbon hotel in 1955, one of the richest men in the world, by some estimates worth $280 million. A man without a country who owned 5% of a territory the size of Western Europe. Iraq nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1972. Saudi Arabia completed its buyout of Aramco in stages through the 1970s. Kuwait nationalized in 1975. The structures the Red Line had built finally came apart. Not through legal challenge, not through U.S. government prosecution, but through the sovereign decisions of the nations that had been inside the line all along. And then, in October 1973, OPEC cut production and imposed an embargo on the United States. The oil price quadrupled in 3 months. The conventional framing of the 1973 crisis is that it was a political act, Arab states punishing the U.S. for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. That's true, but it was also something else. It was the first moment when the nations inside the old Red Line zone had the structural power to set the terms of the relationship themselves. For 45 years, the terms had been set in rooms they weren't in. Think about what it means to draw a line on a map from memory and have that line hold for half a century. Not because it was legal, not because the people inside it consented, but because the people who drew it had the capital, the governments, and the Cold War logic to enforce it. The line is gone. The argument about who owns what's beneath the ground is not.